Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're going to talk today about how the Alexander Technique can help caregivers. Imogen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert. Very pleased to be talking about this subject with you.
Well, I think we should begin for our listeners for you to give us a short uh, definition or description of the Alexander technique before we get into how it's useful.
Sure. So, a way I like to think about the Alexander technique at the moment is that it's a way to transform stress and tension into ease, confidence, and poise.
Hmm.
How's that?
That's great. And stress and tension,
Yeah.
from my limited experience, and I think your much more experience, are something that caregivers end up having to deal with. Maybe it would be good if you gave our listeners a little bit about your own personal story that made you particularly interested in this area.
Yeah, sure. This is definitely something that's important to me personally. And maybe to preface that is that when we're talking about caregivers, we're really talking about um, people who sort of almost accidentally, I mean, it could be by choice, but it could be thrown at them, find themselves in a position where in some way they're having to be responsible for the care of a family member, a friend, family members mainly. Usually, but not particularly professional caregivers, although many of the things that we're talking about could also help
Hmm.
them, right?
Hmm.
So my situation, I am English. Maybe your listeners can detect that.
I think they'll pick up on that.
And they may have noticed that I am in Wilmington, Delaware, which is in the United States.
Right.
So my parents um, lived in um, lived in England, or continue to live. My mother continues to live in England. My father um, died last year. But basically, I'm an only child, and when things started to deteriorate with their health, um, actually, in particular with my mother who has Alzheimer's, even though I lived thousands of miles away, I became the responsible person to make sure things were in place that they could manage, which at first was just having, maybe they had someone who cleaned their house for them, and she came a little bit more often to do a few things just to make things sure things were kept up. I took over doing grocery shopping online for them and having it delivered to their house when my mum no longer became able to go out and get, shopping herself. She
Hmm.
could no longer drive and she could no longer choose the right things.
Right.
um,
Right.
so there were various things like that, and over time that built up. We had professional caregivers going in, starting once a week, and then a couple of times a week, then once a day, then twice a day. By the end, they were 3 or 4 times a day to help them and get my mum dressed in the morning, get her ready for bed at night, all those sorts of things. But there were many times that, so also to just let you know, my dad was very frail, but cognitively okay. And, I'd be dealing with phone calls from him mostly when things were not going well. My mum went wandering in the night.
Hmm.
Had to get the police out. I'd be on the phone, so you can just imagine that was very.
Right.
uh, and then when I did visit, and I would go 3 or 4 times a year for a couple of weeks each time, I was in the house 24/7, primary caregiver, and that has its own other set of stress than being a long distance caregiver.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. So now my mother's in a care home, and I'm still the responsible party. I'm her legal power of attorney, guardian. But things are a lot easier now that she is in that situation,
Hmm.
uh, for me.
Right, but um, there is, e- even when things are easier as they are now, there's still a lot, I would imagine, a lot of emotional
Yeah,
strain.
absolutely. And you don't know when, I mean, this is true of life, right? We don't know when things could change in a moment, but I'm
Right,
enjoying a relatively stable time
right.
right now. But yeah, I'm responsible. I have to, she was in hospital in May, and I was the one who had to make any decisions about, if there was anything that needed to be decided about.
Hmm. Hmm.
She's
Right,
she's not able to do that for herself. So that I know, and financial decisions for her. So
right,
that's another, yeah,
right. Because as I recall, you were in charge of selling their home,
yeah.
and that
That
was
was
done,
a
and
Yeah. We talked
that's
about that in a podcast about stress specifically. That
right.
was there's all sorts of stressful things about that. Selling any home can be stressful, and then there was the emotional attachment to a home that had been mine since a little girl, and then things going wrong and getting delayed and
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
sorts of things. Yeah.
So, and apart, quite apart, or maybe not quite apart, but a little different from emotional strain would be, I assume, quite a bit of physical stress. You had to do things, lift people,
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think the biggest stresses were emotional,
Hmm.
wondering what's happening, the next deterioration.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know for some families there's a kind of family dynamics, and even, if there's lots of siblings, that can be great because you're supporting each other, but there can also be differences of opinion and,
Hmm. Hmm.
all that sort of thing. Um, so as far as the physical things that caregivers may come up against, they, like you say, may have more physical tasks, especially if you're in the home and are the primary caregiver for your loved one. You may be you may have to literally move that person or help them transition from sitting to standing or getting in and out of bed.
Hmm.
And what Alexander technique can help you with is help you use yourself, your body, in a way that's more mechanically advantageous, that you're not compressing yourself so much, so you're not going to injure yourself, or you're not,
Right.
much less likely to. There's no guarantees, obviously, but you're much less likely to, either an acute injury or something that builds up over time because um, of the physical stress, which, of course, I should say, emotional stress is physical stress.
Of
It
course. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
expressed physically in our body. And so, it's all very tied in together. But
Right.
yeah, so if we're not going into those stress patterns as strongly, which is one of the really um, super things that the Alexander technique gives you a way to do, to shift your awareness and thinking in the moment, to release a little tension, be a
Hmm.
little bit
Hmm.
more naturally upright without forcing yourself into any shape. Um, that interrupts these stress responses. It might be a moment later, you're right back into the situation, but you're disrupting that progression into um, how you can kind of catastrophize, or if you think of it physically, you could imagine someone's posture over time when they're dealing with that situation getting more and more um, collapsed and stressed and hunched over, right? So you're
Yeah.
disrupting that pattern, so you're not going into it as strongly. Um,
Right.
it,
Yeah. And I think people listening, if you're a younger person listening, this might not seem quite as daunting, but a lot of people who are caring for older adults are pretty old themselves.
yeah, right. I mean, often it's the first caregiver for someone else is often their spouse.
Right. Yeah.
Um, um,
Well, but
so
even like people these days are living to 80s
yeah,
and 90s, and even their children may not be
yeah,
that young.
exactly. You
Yeah.
may exactly. Um,
Right.
and even if you're very young and looking after your great grandfather,
Oh
it can
yeah.
still be very stressful.
Absolutely.
And you could be creating patterns unconsciously that even after after the grandfather has passed away or whatever, which unfortunately that's another part of this, that's kind of the end result of this process, but you're not setting yourself up for patterns that are going to be with you then for the rest of your life.
Hmm. And I think from my limited experience in this area, um, part of the emotional stress is the uncertainty about exactly when you're going to get a emergency call.
Yeah, it was for me, that was almost the hardest thing. And to this day, every time the home phone rings, because I mainly use my cell phone, but my father only used the landline, basically. He
Right,
couldn't get his head round find, a new telephone number at this point.
right,
Um,
right.
and when to this day, I hear the landline.
Yeah.
And I can feel that little stress response wants to start, and it's like, and
Hmm.
then I can use the Alexander technique to
Hmm.
help me come out of it.
Right. Do you want to say just a little more about specifically how the Alexander technique can help with emotional strain or mental strain? I think most people have some who know anything about it or have some idea how useful it can be with physical excess strain or tension, but
Mm.
emotional is a little more abstract, perhaps. I don't know. What could you say a word or two about the technique and emotional stress?
Sure. um, yeah, so if you think about something that you find emotionally stressful, so in this context, it could be um, worrying about the progression of the illness of your loved one, wondering what you should decide, what's the best course of action, simply being sad about what's happening. I mean, my mother has Alzheimer's and um, she does still recognize me, whether she can say my name or not. But seeing that loss of that intelligent, organized woman,
Mm-hmm.
she's still alive, but she's
Right.
not there anymore. So that's all the sort of emotional stresses
Mm-hmm.
we can have, those sorts of things. And what Alexander Technique gives me is it gives me um, mindful tools to, you might call it center myself, to ground myself, to um, kind of like I was saying, to shift the way I think
Mm-hmm.
in the moment that disrupts that stress response for a
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
And if something is really, kicking off, it may be like a back and forth, it's not like you're going to think this thing, oh, I'm not stressed anymore.
Right.
that's not
Right.
that's not how it works. But you have interrupted in a useful way um, that stress response.
Right. And I think,
Uh,
yeah, go
and
ahead.
you can, with practice, and I've been teaching this a long time, and I have ways that I've learned and I've developed that I practice every day.
Hmm.
So I have kind of rehearsed for this in one way. It's
Right.
um,
So
but
maybe,
it gives you something to do that's constructive in just in one moment
hmm,
to help yourself be a little less tense. If you think that we're maybe always moving between being more stressed and more at ease, it gives you a way to just for a moment move a little bit more toward the direction of being at ease. Um,
right, right. And,
if
and I
we do it
think I think
all
it's
the time.
useful to maybe for people who may find that idea a little abstract, who can accept, the Alexander technique can help you with your physical activities, but the emotional stuff seems like in a different category. But if you think about the very term stress and tension,
It's the
especially,
same thing.
exactly. I mean, tension, emotional stress. I can't imagine emotional stress not having a physical uh,
Yeah,
contraction, tightening
yeah,
aspect to it.
exactly. So here's maybe a concrete example. If you could think of someone walking, and if
Hmm.
you think of someone walking who is stressed or angry, you'll see that in their walk.
Exactly.
If you
Exactly.
walk, you're looking at someone who's depressed, you'll see that in their walk.
They'll be
And the
literally physically
Yeah, there'll be a
depressed.
physical
Yeah.
expression of those things.
Right.
And with the Alexander technique, you may not even have to think about that you're interrupting the emotional stress. You could just notice,
Hmm.
um, I would like to walk a little bit more freely than I am right now, and you
Hmm.
can give some, we call it directions or constructive thinking, or just some ways of thinking and be aware. You can just
Right.
think to yourself that helps you in that moment walk a little bit more freely and easily, more naturally upright. And that has also helped interrupted the emotional stress pattern because it's all one and the
It
same.
really is one and the same, or maybe more. Yeah, one and the same, or you could view it as different aspects of the same
Yeah,
thing.
yes. But
So,
they're happening synergistically, if you like,
yeah,
simultaneously. It's at the same time.
exactly. And I know in our little conversation before we began, you wanted to mention activities for self care that caregivers might want to be doing and how the technique could help with those. Do you want to say a word or two about that before we come to an end?
Yeah, sure. The first thing I'd like to say is that I actually think Alexander technique is a method of self-care in one way of thinking about it. It's a
Absolutely,
way
yeah.
to take care of how you are using your whole self, body and mind, whatever you are doing.
Hmm.
So it can help you look after yourself while you're moving your loved one from their bed to the chair,
Hmm.
or putting a bandage on, or having to make that phone call to the doctor about something. So it helps you in the way that we've talked before.
Hmm.
Um, but there's also like this other layer because it has this sort of foundational quality. There may be things that you can do to relieve stress. Exercise is something that people do to relieve stress. Singing, there's other things. But Alexander Technique can help you with those things as well. So it's adding a layer of self care to the things that you do for self care.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
So that when you're playing your game of tennis,
Hmm.
you again might be less likely to injure yourself because you're moving more freely and easily. You're not taking the stresses and strains of the caregiving into the tennis game as much. Yeah.
Or even taking a nap,
I-
or sleeping. The Alexander technique would be a great process to use to kind of take you into that nap.
Absolutely.
You
And I
know,
know people, and we were going to get, excuse me, we have a group that I and another Alexander teacher, Laura Donnelly, have started called Caregivers Central.
hmm
It's an online community that supports caregivers, and we use some tools from the Alexander technique to help people in exactly the ways we've been talking about. And one of the things people have said that they use one particular way to help them get to sleep at night. And, if you're not sleeping well, everything's going to suffer. So if you can do something that's not, um, taking really strong medications, because you also might need to be alert in the night if something
exactly.
goes
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
So there's all sorts of ways
right.
it can help. And I guess I should also mention constructive rest, as we've mentioned self-care,
hmm
because that's another super self-care tool that's one that a lot of Alexander Technique teachers use with their students, and it's a way of lying down that, in and of itself, the position is
Right. It's a very specific
advantageous. Yeah.
self configuration that's very easy to do. You really
Mhm.
don't have to do much of anything except put yourself in that position, and it's a pretty good stress releaser just by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's there's one other aspect to the self-care and the stress relief that I think is very important to caregivers, um, because obviously when you're caring for someone else, their well-being is of kind of primary importance. Their needs become the the primary focus often, and one of the things I'm very, I don't know, passionate about almost, is that it's really important to take care of yourself so that you're more able to take care of someone else. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but also in the moment that, well, certainly with people with dementia, but anyone, when you're more at ease and not displaying, I don't know, anxiety or other ways that stress comes out, it helps the person that you're with. So, um, so for instance, with me and my mother who has dementia, she may not cognitively be able to have any sort of conversation with me, but she will pick up on nonverbal cues. If
hmm
I'm anxious or angry or agitated in some way, she will pick up on that. And so it's really helpful to her if people are more calm and at ease, and she can pick up on that.
Yes,
Um,
that's a really good point. Even,
yeah,
yeah, people are pretty sensitive. Even people who are
I mean,
cognitively impaired are pretty sensitive often to what's
yeah,
going on around them emotionally.
yeah. I mean, and of course, the same is with any family member, however, whatever their kind of mental situation, um, the 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 less stressed out you are,
hmm
you're not transmitting that to that other person.
Exactly. Well, maybe this is a good place to end our conversation. What do you think?
Well, I had just one thing that your listeners might be interested in if they're in a caregiving situation,
Mm-hmm.
um, is that through this Caregiver Central group, a few times a year, we run a little mini self-care challenge, which we call the easy peasy, itsy bitsy, teeny weeny, something like this, self-care challenge for caregivers. And the reason we've got such a silly and long title is that caregivers probably don't believe they have time
Right,
for
right.
self-care.
Yeah.
These things are so easy and short that you can do them in a couple of minutes. But they're just little things that you can do to look after yourself a little bit more in a moment. And it's a 7 day mini challenge, and um, you can sign up for it through our website. If you sign up for our mailing list, you'll get notified when we run it. It's completely free, and it'd be a way to find out a little bit more about what we do.
Excellent. So I'll put a link to that web page where anyone listening can explore the options you just mentioned,
Right.
and a way for you to be connected with others who are in similar circumstances to you,
Right.
right? Through your Facebook page, right? That's all on that website.
You'll find all the information
All
there.
everything you need will be there. So I think and I'll also put a link for anyone who wants to learn more about the Alexander technique in general or wants to locate a teacher in their area. I'll put a link to a site that will enable you to do that. So I think we've pretty much covered it, right?
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that's great. Thank you, Robert.
Oh, sure. So I just want to just final word. My guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. Imogen, thank you so much for being on the show.